The time is just gone 6 minutes past 8, and we kick off this morning looking at the allegations and the allegedly 46-year-old Israeli gang leader attached to a criminal organization in Israel who was arrested in South Africa. We're going straight across to be joined by Chad Thomas, organized crime expert. Chad, good morning to you and welcome to the show.
Good morning, and thank you so much for asking me to join you this morning.
Yes, wonderful. Now, Chad, you have been investigating the mob since the late 1990s. And I've actually been keeping an eye out on this story that has broken out and unfolded, and also on social media. There's been just so much talk about this gang leader who is attached to this criminal organization. I mean, just take us back, in terms of your investigations and, some of the issues that you were focusing on.
So, my organization investigates primarily financial crime. Financial crime invariably is linked to organized crime. And we've noticed over the last 3 decades in South Africa an increase in organized crime activity from international fugitives making South Africa their home, using South Africa to launder illicit funds. Hence, the fact that we're looking at South Africa actually being grey listed because of the issues pertaining to our management of illicit funding investigations in South Africa. But when one looks at organized crime as a whole, South Africa, it's not unusual for South Africa to become a haven for organized crime figures. If one looks at the most high profile case, it dates back to the mid 1980s, when Vito Palazzolo, who was allegedly one of the top five of the Sicilian mafia, made his home in South Africa and was only arrested a few years ago when he left South Africa to go to Thailand and was arrested on an Interpol red notice. But in respect of the Israeli mafia, there wasn't very much activity involving them. They tend to keep their activities very on the lowdown, simply because they don't want to have attention focused on them. That changed in the late 90s, early 2000s, when we saw some high-profile assassinations, including that of Hazel Crane, Shai Avisar, and others, all of which were allegedly at the time linked to an Israeli mafia figure by the name of Lior Saat. He was later found in Maputo and extradited back to South Africa for trial, but he was then found that witnesses had disappeared, witnesses had been taken out, and the case fell apart, and he then left South Africa. It was fairly quiet in South Africa in respect of the Israeli mafia. We saw other organizations growing. We saw an influx in Serbian nationals. We even saw Arkan's killers who were found guilty in absentia for the horrendous acts that took place in Bosnia-Herzegovina during the early 90s. Two of Arkan's killers later emerged in South Africa, and they were linked to both local organized crime as well as international organized crime. With respect to the Israelis, however, in 2015, a supposed Israeli mob boss was arrested in South Africa. His brother, strangely enough, was arrested a couple of months ago and accused of being a major mafia leader in Israel by the surname of Musli. This chap was arrested in 2015. His brother's been arrested recently in Israel. And the cooperation between South Africa and Israel has always been, although strained from a geopolitical perspective, from a law enforcement perspective, there's always seems to have been cooperation. One goes back to 2016, when the Israelis asked South Africa to extradite Rabbi Eliezer Berland, and the South African authorities cooperated. Together with Interpol, there was a raid on his compound. He was arrested and subsequently extradited to Israel. So hearing that there's mafia activities in South Africa shouldn't be unusual for us. Although we've got sufficient homegrown criminals, and the fact that we're importing criminals should be of concern, the fact that our infrastructure and the resources that our law enforcement have in South Africa is so stretched as a result of issues such as state capture and other criminal activities, we can't be surprised that so many international syndicates are making South Africa their haven, their backyard, the place they go to hide and then to even continue with their criminal activities.
Yes, in fact, South Africa seems to be easy pickings as far as all these international syndicates are concerned. And looking at, like you mentioned, there's so many of them. In fact, you spoke about Eastern Europe and you spoke about Serbia, but also one cannot forget from Africa itself. You're looking at out of Nigeria. Look at the drug trade. We look at the kidnappings that are taking place. There appears to be some sort of a Pakistan connection. The whole issue surrounding what's Dubai ransoms being paid in the UAE, and South Africa seems to be a haven. Now, just coming back to this particular instance with regard to the Israeli mafia, now we see that there have been, apart from just looking at some of the financial crimes that we've been talking about, but there are some serious crimes here. We're talking about conspiracies to commit murder. We're talking about drug trafficking. We're talking about extortion. We're talking about a whole host of criminal activities, Chad.
I think the greatest concern here is that South Africa wasn't being used just as a place to hide from the Israeli authorities. The criminal activities continued while they were in South Africa. What's of great concern is the fact that they found weapons as well as what they believe is a vehicle that was converted to be used as a kind of a sniper type device. In other words, this vehicle was converted so that they could fit rifles into it, so people wouldn't know where the shots were coming from. If that's the case, it means that the syndicate wasn't just involved in violence in Israel and in drug trafficking from South Africa, but may even be involved in murder for hire. And we've seen a lot of high-profile assassinations the last few years involving the underworld, and clashes in the underworld from people of all nationalities. But these turf wars have been taking place on South African soil, and that's of grave, grave concern.
Yes. Now, just looking at the capacity, and as you mentioned, we are stretched because of our own internal issues, but the capacity to deal and to prosecute these international crime syndicates in the country. Do we have the capacity? We know one of the high profile cases, or one of the highest profile cases, was the one of Radovan Kriche. That was just one. But looking at many others that possibly are arrested, that will be brought to book. Do we have the capacity to deal with it yet?
You made the you made the observation that our law enforcement is stretched in South Africa, and you're not wrong. We have the legislation. We have a very important piece of legislation that was promulgated in 1998, known as the Prevention of Organized Crime Act. It's loosely based on the American RICO, which is the Racketeering Act, which was introduced in America in 1970, but only really used with success in America in the early 80s by Rudolph Giuliani when going after the mob in New York. In South Africa, that legislation was used in 1999, just 1 year after it had been promulgated. So it's an incredible piece of legislation that allows for racketeering investigations, allows for money laundering investigations, allows for proceeds of crimes to be preserved by the state in terms of interim restraints and later preservation orders. When it comes to a case like this, however, you need to understand that it's interjurisdictional, which means that you have a lot of state actors from various jurisdictions. And of course, with our country focusing on coming out of those years of capture, our specialist prosecutors and our specialist investigators from the Hawks have been seconded to units like the investigating directorate within the NPA. So there's been a bit of a skill loss, but there are still sufficient remedies in place, and there are also driven members. And you mentioned other syndicates as well as kidnapping. When one looks at the syndicates that originated out of Mozambique that then started kidnapping South Africans, and they did, of course, have ties back to, like you mentioned, Pakistan, and of course there was the money laundering aspect through Dubai. Our crime intelligence have taken a very hard stance on that. And together with the kidnapping task team, we've seen a lot of good results in recent months. I do believe that we can turn the corner provided the capacity issues are addressed. Because as it stands right now, there was already a backlog of cases needing to be enrolled in the criminal courts. We then had COVID for 2 years, which has added a further 2-year backlog and strain on a system that is already breaking at the seams. We need to just ensure that there are adequate replacements. Bekele came out and said this week that he's signing off per month on 300 retirements of senior members within the South African police services. We're not seeing them replaced. If we're losing such a brains trust of 300 senior officers a month in South Africa, that can only impact negatively on crime in South Africa and make us even more attractive to international syndicates.
Well, it certainly is. And yesterday we've seen Shamila Batoy actually issue a statement as well, Ched, with regard to the lack of skills within the investigators authorities as well.
It's a major issue. A lot of people have been disillusioned within the state structures and moved across into the private sector, and they haven't been replaced timelessly, or there hasn't been a skill transfer. While we still have capable members that are reaching retirement age, there should be a succession plan in place, both at the National Prosecuting Authority, as well as at the DPCI, as well as at SAPS, and any of the related units that support the fight against crime, be it the AFU, the FIC, and others. We don't see these succession plans in place, and that is of concern to us.
Yes, and also I think with an ever-changing climate and an environment, and you mentioned the vehicle and the sophistication with which these criminal syndicates actually operate. Are we able to counter them? Because they would find a new method, they would find innovative methods to operate within this country. And while we have this lack of skills, while we are losing people that are highly experienced, that are skilled, I'm sure these syndicates are taking advantage and taking opportunities out of the situation that we are in internally in the country.
So I think the South African Police Service leadership, the National Prosecuting Authority leadership, and all associated law enforcement agencies need to stop and take a hard look at their structures and themselves and understand that they can't do it alone. There is a wealth of knowledge within the private sector, and there's also partnerships that they can have with international law enforcement agencies. We saw that this was a success because it was driven by not just South African crime intelligence, South African detective services, but Interpol was also involved, as well as other agencies. So if we can see public-private partnerships that include the private sector, be it law firms that give up time to assist in prosecutions, be it forensic audit firms that give up time to assist in the investigation of crimes, we can make a difference. If it wasn't for the fact that we had security companies in support of the police during the July unrest last year, it may have turned out very, very differently. So once the acceptance is there that they can't do this alone, that they need the assistance of the private sector as well as foreign agencies, perhaps then we'll be able to turn the tide.
Well, this is a problem, a general problem right across the country. And as you mentioned, in terms of drawing in expertise from the private sector, and we see it even with the likes of ESCOM and state owned enterprises. And, this is where the private sector actually needs to come in, because we've just lost so much by way of skills. We've lost a lot, just out of sheer negligence on the part of the authorities, Jed.
You're 100% right. There's been a massive recruitment drive in certain areas for individuals to take up positions of leadership. And on paper, they have the qualifications, but it's just paper qualifications. They've been through varsity, but they haven't experienced the actual challenges on the ground. And that's why skills transfer is so important in this country at this point in time. And we're not seeing that. We've seen through the 90s into the early 2000s, there's been what we call voluntary severance packages accepted by people. This has created somewhat of a brain drain. What we now need to see is the skill transfer taking place, the succession planning in place. And like I mentioned earlier, reading that the Minister of Police is signing off on 300 retirements of senior officers a month does not bode well in respect of the capabilities that we see at the very top.
Yes, and just finally, Ched, with this arrest of this gang leader, just going forward, I mean, what would you like to see?
Well, obviously, we'd like to see him extradited, but if any crimes were committed on South African soil, and it would appear that there may have been, because there has been an inference made that drugs were found on the premises. Obviously, they still have to be tested to ascertain whether, in fact, it was drugs. There were illicit weapons that were found there. So, how were those weapons obtained? So, illegal weapons in itself is a criminal offense. And then, of course, there's the suspicion that these guys may have been used in what we term murder for hire. And if that's the case, and they are into South African cases, then before any extradition takes place, they need to be tried on our soil. They need to account for their crimes that were committed on our soil, serve their time here, and thereafter they can be extradited. Much the same as we've seen with Radovan Krejcir.
Well, Chad, thank you very much for that and for your time with us as always
Thank you
here
so
on
very much.
Salam Media. All the best to you.
You too.
Chet Thomas, IRS forensic investigator and also organized crime expert, against the background of the Israeli gang leader attached to a criminal organization allegedly in Israel, arrested in South Africa. The time is just gone 8:21. We're going to go for a break. We come back. We will be focusing on the latest coming out of the inquest into the murder of the late Imam Abdullah Harun.